It's official. The United States just lost a massive piece of its Canadian supply chain, and prices here at home are already going haywire. New England's electricity bills are spiking nearly 100% higher than last year. Lumber prices are climbing double digits, and Midwest gasoline, analysts say it could jump another 10 to 20 cents a gallon before Thanksgiving. The cause isn't a single dramatic press conference or a politician signing an embargo order. It's something much subtler and in many ways more dangerous. A series of selective choke points in Canada's exports that, put together, act like an invisible hand turning the screws on U.S. consumers. Today, we're pulling the curtain back on what's happening between Ottawa and Washington, and why this quiet export squeeze could cost American households far more than anyone is admitting. To understand how we got here, you have to rewind to March 4th, 2025, the day Washington's new tariff regime on Canadian imports officially kicked in. It wasn't just aimed at steel or aluminum. For the first time in decades, U.S. trade rules slapped duties on a much wider basket of Canadian goods, including electricity. Within days, the impact was visible in real-time data. Hydro-Quebec, the crown jewel of Canada's hydropower industry, simply stopped exporting power through the Phase 2 intertie into New England's grid. That's a 2,000-megawatt lifeline, historically supplying about 11% of the region's electricity demand, gone overnight. ISO New England's price charts tell the story. March 2025, real-time electricity prices averaged $45.48 per megawatt hour, up 96% from the year before. The day-ahead market saw a 94% jump. And electricity wasn't the only thing hit. Lumber, one of Canada's most essential exports to the U.S., was already under pressure. Production in Canada had fallen nearly 43% since 2004, and by early 2025, it was still sliding another 6.8%. Tariffs poured gasoline on that fire, adding costs and fueling talk in British Columbia about imposing quotas on exports to the U.S. Lumber prices in the states jumped more than 15% year over year by August. Meanwhile, in the oil market, the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, which came online in 2024, gave Alberta the ability to send hundreds of thousands of barrels a day to non-U.S. buyers in Asia. That meant the U.S. could no longer rely on being the automatic destination for Canadian heavy crude. When tariffs narrowed the Canadian discount even further, refiners in the Midwest started running the numbers, and they didn't like the math. Higher crude input costs meant higher gasoline prices, especially in regions most dependent on Canadian barrels. Layer on top of that a year of logistical nightmares, a national rail shutdown in August 2024 that froze grain and potash shipments, and a wildfire season in 2025 burning more than 4 times the 10-year average area, and you've got a perfect storm for export slowdowns. The result? Not a total collapse in Canadian exports, but a highly targeted set of disruptions that land like a punch to the gut in specific U.S. markets. Let's break down the numbers, sector by sector, because when you see them in context, the pattern is undeniable. Electricity is the most immediate and visible case. Hydro-Quebec's Phase 2 intertie is capable of delivering 2,000 megawatts straight into the U.S. grid. Over the past 5 years, Canadian imports have averaged around 11% of New England's total load, a huge chunk for a region with tight winter capacity. The moment tariffs hit, flows on that line dropped to near zero. According to ISO-Ne's own market monitor, that supply loss was one of the primary drivers of the nearly 100% increase in March 2025 prices. That spike didn't just hit residential bills, it raised costs for manufacturers, data centers, and hospitals across the Northeast. Lumber tells a slower but equally painful story. Canada's structural decline in output from around 35 billion board feet in 2004 to about 20 billion in 2024 has been a slow-motion crisis for U.S. builders. Add tariffs and the threat of Canadian quotas, and the price for standard framing lumber was up 15.1% year over year as of August 8, 2025. That means more expensive homes, costlier renovations, and tighter margins for construction firms. Oil and fuels are another pressure point. The U.S. imported a record 4.3 million barrels per day of Canadian crude in July 2024, but that was before tariffs started to bite and before Alberta had new options to send oil west to the Pacific. With the Trans Mountain expansion allowing 590,000 barrels a day to reach Asian buyers, Canadian exporters can play markets off against each other. As tariffs narrowed the Western Canadian Select discount to just around $11 per barrel in March 2025, refiners in the Midwest, heavily reliant on that crude, began warning of a 10 to 20 cent per gallon risk to gasoline prices. Agriculture and fertilizer face their own set of headaches. Canada supplies roughly 46% of U.S. potash imports, and Nutrien, the world's largest potash producer, has openly warned that tariffs will raise American farm input costs. Then there's the August 2025 shock from Beijing, a 75.8% provisional anti-dumping duty on Canadian canola, a $5 billion Canadian dollar export lane effectively shut overnight. While that's aimed at China, not the U.S., it scrambles global veg oil trade flows in ways that could still ripple into American food prices. Finally, logistics and nature have become wild cards. The August 2024 rail shutdown froze critical export corridors for days, and the 2025 wildfire season, already quadruple the 10-year average in area burned by mid-June, is threatening forestry output and transportation networks again. When you connect all these data points, the conclusion is unavoidable. The U.S. is paying more, not because Canada quit the trade game entirely, but because targeted export slowdowns in just a few key categories are enough to spike prices in the markets that matter most. In every economic shock, there are winners and losers, and in this cross-border squeeze, the dividing lines are sharp. On the winning side, Canadian producers in certain sectors are discovering newfound leverage. Hydro-Quebec, for example, can now redirect power to domestic demand or other export markets without competing on tariff-bloated U.S. terms. In the oil patch, Alberta crude exporters have more bargaining power than ever thanks to the Trans Mountain expansion. Being able to reach buyers in Asia means they're no longer price takers for U.S. refineries. They can hold out for better deals. Some Canadian lumber mills, those able to pivot toward domestic projects or alternative markets, are managing to avoid the worst of the tariff hit, and in fact, they can command higher prices from U.S. buyers desperate for supply. Meanwhile, agricultural exporters outside the canola sector, such as wheat or pulses, may even benefit from China's canola duties if those trade flows reroute and free up shipping capacity for other crops. But for the losers, the pain is immediate and hard to escape. In the U.S., New England households and businesses are staring down power bills nearly twice what they paid a year ago. Manufacturers that rely on stable electricity costs are seeing margins squeezed, with some already passing those costs on to consumers. Home builders, contractors, and do-it-yourself homeowners across the U.S. are all paying more for lumber, adding thousands to the cost of new builds and renovations. In the Midwest, refiners face tighter crude margins, which trickle down directly into higher gasoline and diesel prices. That, in turn, raises transportation costs for every sector, from groceries to online retail. American farmers, especially in the Grain Belt, are caught in the middle on fertilizer. Potash prices creeping upward mean higher input costs, just as many are trying to recover from volatile commodity prices and extreme weather. And while China's canola move isn't aimed at the U.S., it could still disrupt feed and vegetable oil markets here if Canadian exporters flood alternative markets that compete with U.S. producers in Canada. Not everyone is celebrating. Sectors like forestry still face deep structural decline. Rail operators, port authorities, and small exporters who depend on steady U.S. access are feeling the pinch from both tariffs and the political chill in Ottawa-Washington relations. And canola farmers, suddenly locked out of a multi-billion-dollar Chinese market, are bracing for lower farm gate prices unless new buyers can be found quickly. This isn't a one-sided war. It's a complex, slow-moving reshuffle of trade flows where targeted export disruptions in Canada ripple outward, boosting some, gutting others, and leaving consumers in both countries footing the bill. If this were a short-term spat, we could wait it out. But the reality is, most of these changes aren't going away anytime soon. The U.S. tariffs that triggered this cascade are baked into policy, and Washington hasn't shown any appetite to reverse them. Ottawa, for its part, is under political pressure to prove it won't be bullied into trade concessions, especially in an election year. In the energy sector, don't expect Hydro-Quebec to rush back into the U.S. market under the current tariff structure. New England will likely remain exposed to higher power prices through the winter, especially if cold snaps hit and domestic generation can't keep up. Lumber markets may stabilize slightly if U.S. housing starts cool in the fall, but with Canadian production capacity structurally lower and talk of quotas still on the table, builders shouldn't bank on prices dropping back to pre-tariff levels. Oil and fuel prices in the Midwest will continue to hinge on the WCS-WTI spread and Alberta's willingness to prioritize Pacific exports. If Asian buyers keep paying a premium, U.S. refiners will remain price takers, and that means consumers will keep feeling it at the pump. Agriculture could see the most unpredictable swings. If Canada can't replace the Chinese canola market quickly, we may see oversupply pressure in North America, possibly offering short-term relief for U.S. feed buyers, but at the cost of Canadian farm income. Meanwhile, fertilizer costs will stay sensitive to any additional tariff or logistics shocks. From a macro perspective, this is a reminder that trade between the U.S. and Canada is less a steady free flow and more a network of pressure points. Block 1 or 2, and prices can spike overnight in the most sensitive sectors. This isn't a total export shutdown, it's a targeted squeeze, and that's what makes it so effective and so difficult to counter. For businesses, the takeaway is clear: diversify supply chains now, before the next shock hits. For households, be prepared for persistent volatility in everything from utility bills to construction costs to grocery prices. And for policymakers, understand that tariff brinkmanship with your largest trading partner isn't a cost-free exercise. It's a direct line to higher inflation at home. So, as the headlines shout, Canada shuts down exports and markets keep reacting, the real story is a quieter one. A neighbor that knows exactly where the pressure points are and isn't afraid to use them. If you want to keep following how this plays out, who benefits, who gets hurt, and what it means for your wallet, make sure you stay tuned. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who still thinks U.S.-Canada trade is unshakable, because the truth is, the cracks are already showing.